Okay, let us rock and roll. I want to share before we start with this week's Parsha of Naso. I want to share a short thought related to the holiday of Shavuot, which just ended, but which is definitely applicable and relevant to all year round Torah learning. So I heard a question that a rabbi asks. There's a medrash that says there's different reasons that are suggested as to why a big, very important custom, integral part of the structure of the holiday of Shavuos is for people to stay up all night, the first night of Shavuos, learning Torah. And it's a beautiful custom. I was in Eitz Chaim synagogue. There must have been over 100 people for sure, starting at midnight, learning. And, as the night went on, the numbers dwindled a little bit, but coming the first dawn of light, there was still a very strong crowd there. So there's different customs as to why we do that. And one of them is based on a medrash, which seems rather shocking. The medrash says that on the day of the original Matan Torah, the day that Hashem gave our ancestors the Torah, the entire nation slept late. The entire nation snoozed. I don't know if they pressed snoozed or they didn't set an alarm clock, and they all slept late. And we are kind of atoning for that by making sure that we stay up all night learning. We're atoning for this apparent wrongdoing of our ancestors. And the question is obvious. What are the chances that every single person slept through? Right? There wasn't one person who woke up on time. We're talking about the greatest generation. We're talking about there were Jews who were, rabbis and wise men and prophets, and Moshe was there and Aaron was there. Not one person woke up, realized what time it was, and woke up the rest of the nation. It says it can't be that this was just a coincidence. If me and you were told God is coming tomorrow morning, none of us would sleep tonight. It doesn't make sense. So he said it must have been a divine sleep. It must be that for some reason, Hashem decided that they should sleep through, even on such an incredible, life-changing day of the day of Matan Torah. So why would Hashem do that? So I heard one perspective on that, which I think is so encouraging. And that is, I think it's quoted from a book, a Sefer Arugas Habosem, who I have not heard of, but I heard it in his name, so I just want to credit him with it. And he explains that that this was a message to later generations. Hashem knew that there would come a generation that the Jewish people would feel tired and confused and lost. People would struggle to maintain their connection with Hashem and maintain with their connection to the Torah. And then Shavuos is going to come. And we're not going to be ready for Shavuos. We're not going to feel that we are in a spiritual place, that we are ready to really rededicate ourselves to the Torah and to Torah study. And Shavuos was like the wedding between the Jewish people and Hashem. It was like the wedding, the Har Sinai, Mount Sinai was the canopy, and we went to our wedding. But how did we go to our wedding? We went to our wedding from a deep sleep, sleeping well past the time that we should have gotten up. So the message is, if our ancestors could have gone from oversleeping straight to the wedding, straight to receiving the Torah, then we also in later generations who unfortunately feel a lot more disconnected from spirituality than our ancestor did, we can also take the Torah, tap into the Torah and learn the Torah, even if we don't feel spiritually connected to the magnitude of what happens on Shavuos. And I think this is a broader message because it's so easy to be discouraged by looking at ourselves and saying, okay, if I did a spiritual well check on myself, how well am I actually doing? Am I really worthy of committing to the Torah? Am I worthy of learning Torah? Do I even fulfill what it says in the Torah? And if the answer is not 100%, which it is the case for every human being on the planet, so what am I doing trying to learn Torah and connect to Torah if I can't even say with 100% confidence that I'm fulfilling everything that's inside it? The message is if our ancestors could go from sleeping to taking the Torah, we can also go from sleeping to taking the Torah. We can, at any position that we're in, at any state of spirituality that we're in, we can reach for the Torah and we could sit down and we could start learning. And it doesn't matter where we're holding, what our status is, where we are with observance, or where we are with any other aspect of spirituality. If we feel that we can't access the Torah because we're not in a good enough spiritual place, that's our Yetzer Hara talking to us. That's our evil inclination that's trying to trick us into giving up the whole idea of the Torah because we're not feeling worthy. But the message from Hashem himself for putting an entire nation to sleep and not letting any of them wake up on time is that we shouldn't let that stop us. And we should all realize no matter what we're doing day and night, no matter where we're holding in religious connection or spiritual connection, the Torah is there and we could all learn it at any time, all year round. So I thought that was a nice message to share before we start doing some Torah learning. And now let's go into Parshas Naso. So Parshas Naso has the distinct honor of being the longest Parsha in the Torah, which does not mean that this class is going to be the longest class of the year. But it means the reality is that probably means we're going to have to cut out more than we usually do, which is, I guess, a shame. It's a shame. But okay, but let's try to touch on the main points of it. So the beginning of Naso talks about the roles of Aaron's children, the work of the Leviim. And that starts off with a census of the Leviim, because in the last Parsha, in Bamidbar, we talked about the census. We talked about different reasons why Hashem felt a need to count the Jewish people, and the children of Levi, Aaron's children, were counted separately. They had a very unique role of servicing the Mishkan. Other people, were counted from age 20 and up, and their primary role in counting was to prepare them for military service. But here, the Aaron's children did not do military service. Their age bracket for their work in the Mishkan was from age 30 to 50, was considered the ideal state of maturity and probably physical strength also, which was needed for certain aspects of the service in the Mishkan. So first we talk about the unique role of each of Aaron's children. Then I'm going to bullet point past the points that we're not going to delve into too much, but I think it's worthwhile to have an overview of what the main themes are. So if you bump into somebody in the supermarket and he says, "Hey, what's going on in this week's Parsha?" you could say, "Oh, no big deal." We start off with the counts of Aaron's children. Then we talk about if somebody is contaminated, they need to go outside of the camp. So the camp of traveling in the desert was the center, was the Mishkan. And then surrounding that was Levi, Aaron's children, who were servicing the Mishkan. And then surrounding that was the other camps. So if somebody was contaminated, and there's various reasons why that could happen, somebody could be in close proximity to a dead body and become contaminated. Other things that could be done as well. Tsaras, for example, which we spoke about in Parshas Metzora a little while back already, is the spiritual skin disease that came from speaking Lashon Hara, speaking negatively. So these are different types of contamination, and a person would need to go outside of the camps until he became pure and ready to go back into civilization, so to speak. I guess the very first quarantine, but this was spiritual quarantine, not physical quarantine. Okay, and then we talk about, so in the Torah, there's a prohibition against stealing, and stealing is unique because the Torah says don't do it, and then the Torah says, but if you do it, here's what you should do, which is not so common. Here's what you could do to rectify that, and that is to give the item that you stole back. So in this parsha, we talk about stealing from Hekdesh, because we're talking, that's the context here. We're talking about holy things, service in the Mikdash. So now we're going to say, okay, what happens if somebody consecrated, he said something is going to be holy to Hashem, donated to the Mishkan, or property of a Kohen, or etc., and then somebody takes it and uses it for mundane purposes. So that's called Me'ilah. And if somebody does Me'ilah by using something holy for mundane purposes, he has to pay a penalty. When he pays it back, he needs to pay a penalty of 1/5, 20%, like tax penalty on that. Okay, then there is a very unique parsha, very, very unique section, which I could give an entire class on, but I had to pick and choose over here a little, and that is the parsha of Sota. And Sota was a very, very, like I said, unique part of Jewish law, which isn't applicable now, but was applicable when in ancient times. And that was when a man suspected his wife of being disloyal to him and wasn't sure if she actually was with another man or wasn't. It seems that he had reason to suspect that she was hanging out with somebody else. What did that lead to is a little bit unknown. So obviously in Jewish law, if you have witnesses to a crime, so that's how the Jewish court system is set up. But if you didn't have witnesses, so now we're in a pickle, because the husband is clearly suspecting his wife of being disloyal. And if that is true, and she was with someone who she wasn't allowed to be with, then they're not allowed to stay together. This marriage is not allowed to stay. So now what does he do? Does he live with her or not? He's not really sure. So there's a very unique set of guidelines of what to do. And basically the woman will be brought to the mikdash and she would be given a drink to drink, a sort of water with various unusual ingredients that were put into it. Part of it was letters from the Sefer Torah about this parsha, meaning this section of the Torah that talks about these rules were scraped off of the Torah and put into the water, and a couple other unusual ingredients. And the woman was given to drink this. And if she was so now basically we've reached a position that the only person who could determine whether this woman is innocent or not is God himself. And Hashem wanted to set into protocol a way to determine this, because otherwise you'd have a very difficult marriage that can't really exist anymore, but maybe it could, we don't know. So anyway, she drank the water, and if she was innocent, nothing would happen. Not only would nothing happen, she would be given a guarantee, essentially, of a blessing to have healthy children. And if she was guilty, then that water would actually kill her. It would actually destroy her stomach, and it would actually kill her. So there's a lot to talk about here, but just one small perspective I want to mention. It's really unusual for there to be a mitzvah in the Torah that is relying on a miracle. Okay? That is forgive me for saying this, but it's not Hashem's type. It's not normal protocol that Hashem says, I'm going to establish into the nature of the world an area of Jewish law that is dependent on a miracle. That's very, very uncommon. Hashem tries to prevent miracles from happening. He doesn't bring miracles very, very often. Why is it that he's going to be so insistent on working out this issue and this relationship to the extent that he's willing to make a miracle? Because really, that's the only thing that's going to happen here, right? You can't just take one party's personal testimony. No court system in the world would allow that. And here you have no witnesses. So there's nothing that can be done. So the only solution is a godly solution. And what I heard is that the message here is that marital harmony, for a husband and wife to get along and have a strong family relationship is clearly extremely important to Hashem. It's a very simple message. It's that this really matters. The Jewish family is the foundation of Judaism, is the foundation of generations and building our home. And Hashem doesn't want to have a situation where that's in this weird limbo and nothing can be done about it. And therefore, Hashem was, willing to push past what would commonly be the protocol for a mitzvah and be reliant on a miracle. So now we don't have this whole category at all because we don't have our own court system anymore. This could theoretically become applicable, or will become applicable, when we have the rebuilding of the third Beis HaMikdash and Jewish judges that control the land of Israel and have the ability to implement and enforce their own Jewish law system. But for now, we don't have that, and we are going to push on to the topic of the Nazir. So a Nazir is somebody who wants to do something extra for Hashem. Okay, 613 mitzvahs is not enough for him. He wants to do more. So he wants to go to an extra level of disconnecting from this world, from disconnecting from worldly pleasures, and he wants to do that for the sake of Hashem. So he gets inspired, and he feels like he's ready to take an extra step, even beyond what is required or even encouraged in the Torah. And so the status of a Nazir is somebody who commits upon himself that he's going to be a Nazir. And the main two restrictions that he's just brought on himself, one is that he must avoid wine or grapes or any part of a grape. So he can't ever have that, enjoyment of a nice glass of wine. He's gonna stay sober. And the second one is that he doesn't cut his hair. He's gonna let his hair grow out. And there's a very interesting protocol when he finishes his Nazirah. So he could say, okay, I'm gonna be a Nazir for, 6 months, let's say. And now after 6 months, he's ready to go back to normal life. So part of the protocol is that he brings several karbanos, several different types of sacrifice in the Beis HaMikdash. He's going to bring, and that's going to end off. And he's also going to cut his hair, right? He let it grow. Now he's finally going to cut it. And this is going to finish off this time period that he has the status of a Nazir. So the Ramban, I'm going to share today, today's theme is the Ramban, Nachmanides. That's a lot of the perspectives I'm going to share today. So he wants to know, why is it that one needs to bring a karban? Normally, a karban is brought if somebody did something wrong, called a karban chatas. If somebody did something wrong, they bring a karban to atone for that. This guy, what did he do wrong? He did something amazing. He took on some extra high level stringency that he's going to avoid even permitted pleasures of the world. So the Ramban says, really, it's so simple. It says, yes, he did, but now he's finished. Now he's stopping that commitment. He says, for somebody to be on an elevated level and then drop it is not a good thing. Now, of course, we can't always take a commitment for life. And I would say, on the contrary, trying to make a commitment forever is probably not setting ourselves up for success. Having well-defined commitments are easier to keep. But nevertheless, there's still a message here, says Nachmanides, the Ramban, that, as the quote says it's in the Talmud, Marlin Bakodesh ve'ein Marindin Bakodesh. We go up in holiness, but we don't go down in holiness. The context there is talking about various religious items of if they need to be sold, what could they be sold for? So there's like a whole protocol about it. Like, for example, a synagogue cannot be sold. You cannot take a shul and sell it to a church or something like that. But you could buy a church or any random building and turn it into a shul, because that's elevating its holiness. A Sefer Torah, could you sell a Sefer Torah and build a shul with it? There's different levels of holiness. So we want to only go up in holiness. We don't want to go down in holiness. So even though he's done something wonderful, the fact of the matter is that at this point, he's lowering some element of holiness. And for that, he needs a little bit of an atonement for that, because you want to really try to keep that up. So I want to share another idea of the Nazir. And I want to do that through a mashal, a parable. So there was a rabbi. This is actually a true story, but it's being used here as a parable for this idea. So there was a rabbi in Jerusalem who was famous for his Torah classes, and people would travel from far and near to come and hear the classes. And the class was not on Zoom. The class was in a room, which meant that it was limited to how many people can possibly fit in that room. Right here, Zoom, what's the limit on Zoom? Like 400 participants or something? And then you could probably pay like $8.95 a month and get like 10 million or something. So we're not really quite at that point yet. But this rabbi had a packed room and there was not a single extra seat. And people who commonly went to listen to this Torah class, they would have their regular seat. They're like kind of an assigned seat that they would have rights to. And there was a waiting list. If somebody dropped out of the class for whatever reason, there's a waiting list of who's going to replace his seat. So the rabbi gave a very complex class. It was not for beginners. And there was an elderly man who attended this class on a steady basis. And he had himself rights to a seat because he was there for a long time, but he did not have a Torah education. And there was no way that he was understanding the depth of this class. Perhaps he didn't even understand the language. Often a deep Torah class might be in Yiddish or something, might not even be in a language he understood. I don't know exactly what it was, but he wasn't able to understand it, but he came every single day to listen to that class. And there were some people on this waiting list who weren't so happy about it. And, they had, respect to this man, but at the end of the day, maybe one of them should have rights to that seat because they'll actually be able to understand the class and they'll be able to do something with that knowledge. So they went to him as respectfully as they could. And they said, maybe you'd be willing to give your seat to somebody who's really going to understand the class and gain from it. So the elderly man responded by rolling up his sleeves, on both hands, and he showed him that he had big scars all up and down his arm. And he said, I want to tell you the story of these scars. He grew up in Russia. And when he was young, there was two rival mafia groups who were terrorizing the village that he grew up in. One day he was in a cafe and a swarm of angry men burst through the door. They were one of these mafia groups. And the guys from the other mafia group were right next to where this man was. He had nothing to do with them. He just happened to be in a cafe at, the next table over. So these men start pulling out weapons and clubs and attacking all of these, sworn enemies of theirs. And one of them came over to this man, who was then a young man, with a big piece of wood, about to start beating him up. And he started crying and begging for mercy and said, I have nothing to do with that. I'm not in the mafia. I don't have their policies. I'm totally unrelated. I happen to be in this cafe. And the man was furious and couldn't contain himself. He said, if you sit with them, then you are part of them. And he started to beat this guy up. And the scars on his arm was for him trying to protect his face from being hit. He went like this and his arms got really badly beaten up. So the man looks at these people who wanted to go into the shir, and he said, I understand that this Torah class is very difficult, and I don't really understand the Talmud. I don't really understand everything that's being discussed. But one thing I know better than anybody else in this room is that if you sit with them, you're part of them. The people in this room are Torah scholars. The people in this room are connecting to the deepest spirituality, connecting to Hashem's presence that's in the Torah. And I might not be able to understand that, but I want to sit here and I want to associate with them and I want to participate in that. And I'm not going to give that up for anything in the world. And obviously, these men learned a lesson that they'll never forget and quickly apologized and backed down and said, yes, absolutely. You definitely have rights to that. And the message here is that by associating ourselves with goodness, with holiness, we have a lot to gain, even if we're not feeling that we're worthy to be on that level. And the Nazir is a perfect example of that. The Nazir refrains from drinking wine and cutting his hairs. What is he doing? He is not fulfilling a Torah commandment. He is not avoiding a sin. He is avoiding things that are actually permitted, right? But that concept still represents separation from physical pleasure. and trying to connect to something holier and something spiritual. So I don't know how this Nazir is doing spiritually, okay? I cannot say that a Nazir, by definition, is a perfect Jew who fulfills every single mitzvah in the Torah. That would be very unlikely. That would be very unlikely. The Chazal teach us that there's nobody in the world who doesn't sin in any way. So what is this guy doing? What is he taking on some kind of way of distancing himself from the pleasures of this world to connect to something spiritual? Dude, if you want to connect to something spiritual, go fulfill the basic requirements of the Torah. Why is he going on to this? And the answer is that he still desires a connection to Hashem, and he might not be in a position where he can fulfill the entire world, the entire Torah right now, but he is strongly declaring that he wants to associate himself with spirituality. So anyone could be a Nazir. Even a Nazir is not like a gradual climb. It's like you have a regular person, and then you have like really knowledgeable person, and then like a super religious person, and then like the biggest rabbi in the world, and then the Nazir. That's not the chain of command in Judaism. The Nazir is anyone who decides that he wants to associate with holiness, that he wants to take another step to spirituality and another step to distance himself from pleasures of the world and physicality. And what he's saying is, if you sit with them, you're part of them. He's saying, I'm trying to connect to this, and this is what I'm associating myself with. So I think for us as well, it's a similar lesson to what I started off with. Even if we're not in the highest spiritual position that we could be in, there's so much we could do to say, I still want to associate myself with that. In this example with the Torah class, that could also be an example. Somebody could listen to a Torah class and not listen and not fully understand every single part of it, and he's still making a very powerful statement. Somebody could come to prayers. Somebody could come to shul, even though he doesn't understand everything that's going on. And the reality is that that's often the case. Even with people who have been going to shul for decades, don't always understand everything they're saying. So for sure, if somebody hasn't been going for decades and is just thinking about it, maybe for the first time, or they've been there a couple of times and like, wait, what am I coming here for? I don't even understand the language. So yeah, I'm going to take an Art Scroll Siddur and I'm going to try to read the English, but I'm not really going to know where they are unless they turn the page numbers and they announce the page numbers, which they sometimes do, but they don't always do. And it's not easy. So what am I going to gain from that if it's just going to be a half-baked chase through davening of me trying to figure out where I am? And the answer is there's a ton to gain from that, Going, like, for example, in the example of going to shul, there doesn't have to be this specific pathway to get there. I'm connected. I'm feeling connected to Hashem. I learn Hebrew. I could read Hebrew. I could follow the prayers. I become, more religious. And now I'm at a position that I'm ready to walk into the shul. That's not the progression of events. At any time, we could say, I'm going to connect to holiness right now. I'm going to show who I'm associating with, even if I don't understand fully. And I think that message to Hashem is so powerful. It's so unbelievable. I don't know every exact thing. I'm doing a mitzvah. I might not know every aspect of it, the reason behind it, or I'm learning Torah and I don't understand all of it, or I'm learning Torah and I have questions. Like, for example, you can listen to a Torah class and have no questions, right? But you could have 1,000 questions on other areas of the Torah. At any given point in time, okay, just to throw out there, I'm stumped by probably dozens of things in the Torah. But that doesn't stop me from jumping into it more. I don't understand that. I want to try to figure that out. And I hope I, am man enough and I guess not lazy enough to actually put in the time to try to explore these ideas. But in the meantime, I'm showing what's important to me and what I want to associate myself with. So I think that's another lesson that we can take out of this Nazir. Okay, any questions or thoughts on these topics?
Sure. would a person become a Nazir today? Could they say, I want to take on, to become a Nazir? Would that actually, it's possible. But there was someone in our community many years ago who took it on, and then I never kind of followed up and heard. Would there be a reason to do that?
There would be a reason to disconnect from any kind of physical pleasure, literally anything, anything that we enjoy doing that's physical and perhaps is a distraction to our service of Hashem is an amazing thing to try to work on refraining from. Now, what happens if somebody says, I am a Nazir? So first of all, it would be highly discouraged to do such a thing, because declaring so to start, just to give a drop of context here. Okay, so how do you decide that you're a Nazir? You declare that you're a Nazir using a terminology of a swear, like a proper swear. And this is something that is halachically binding. And if somebody declares upon themselves something that's binding according to Jewish law, let's just say they're in trouble, because the reality is that it's probably going to be hard. So for example, anything that comes from grapes is forbidden to a Nazir. So in a world of processed foods, you cannot imagine how many items might have some kind of extract from a grape that we might not even know about. So it would be extremely risky to make such a declaration in this day and age without knowing 1,000,000% that we'll be able to fulfill it. And then the ending of the process of the Nazir can't be done, right? The carbon obviously cannot be done. So I don't think somebody can have on themselves the exact same halachic status of a proper Nazir. I also knew, or more like have come across some people in my days in Israel who were a self-declared Nazir. And I think there could be, I'm sure that they felt a connection to Hashem by going away from wine and by letting their hair grow out. So I don't think anything bad would come out of that, but I don't think it would have the halachic status of the Nazir in the Torah.
Right, that makes sense, because you can't say, I'll become a Nazir, bli neder.
Right, exactly. I mean, right, exactly. But you could make any other Kabbalah bli neder, anything else upon ourselves that we want to refrain from doing, that we could say bli neder. Actually, that we should say bli neder. We should say, that we're doing that. That's actually just comes to show how important that term is. So bli neder means without a promise. So really, anytime we take any commitment, we should say the words bli neder. I'm doing this without a proper vow. Essentially, we're saying without a halachically binding vow. And that's recognizing how strong the power of speech is and how bad it is for us to not listen to our commitment. So yeah, that's why people say bli neder. It's a great thing to say.
Thank you. Perfect. I guess it's just a form of trying to refine ourselves. If we've got maybe a bad habit, like maybe we're drinking too much, and then we take on I'm not going to drink any grapes. Maybe it's just a way of refining ourselves to be closer to Hashem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. I mean, certainly if somebody's wine drinking habits is a distraction, if somebody is drinking too often, or is finding that when he drinks, he does something that's, contrary to Torah values or something like that, that would be an amazing reason. But even not, if somebody just enjoys wine, it's nice to refrain from worldly pleasures, but there's also a balance. Without getting into it too deeply, there are those that say that the reason why a Nazir brings a carbon is because maybe he shouldn't have done that, because Hashem gave us beautiful, enjoyable things to enjoy in this world. And if we're not using it for a bad purpose, maybe one should not say, no, thank you, Hashem. You made such an amazing thing called wine. I'm not interested. Like there are some who say that's why he brings the chatas, when it comes to Jewish holidays, like literally Jewish holidays revolve around wine and grape juice. That's how we bring in the day. That's how we sanctify the day. So, there's two sides of this for sure. Okay, let's get into one more idea. We have a few more minutes left. And this is the real reason why Naso is the longest parsha in the Torah. That is because it talks about the dedication offerings when the Mizbeach, the altar, was finally completed and ready for service. So Jewish people are very excited to actually start using it. So on that day, that's also the first day that Aaron and his children said the blessing of Birkas Kohanim, the blessing that the Kohen gives to the Jewish people. That's the first time that was said. And then we have the offerings of all of the tribal leaders. So each one of the tribes had a leader called a Nasi. And the Nasi would, in the beginning, wanted to bring offerings. He's like kind of representing his tribe. And we finally have the dedication to the Mizbeach. And now they're very excited to actually put this to use. So the context here was the first day of Nisan. And that was the day that the tabernacle was sanctified and Aaron conferred the priestly blessings for the first time. And then each of these leaders of the 12 tribes brought their own personal offerings in celebration of this momentous event. The Levites transported the tabernacle and its parts during the journey, and people donated wagons and oxen to help with transporting all these things. And now they're actually going to bring. So what is the offering that they bring? Okay, this is incredible. I'm going to read from chapter 7, verse 12. The one who brought the offerings on the first day. Okay, so all the leaders are not going to bring the offerings on the same day. That would be chaos. Okay, so they did one day after another. So the first day was Nachshon ben Aminadav from the tribe of Judah, of Yehuda. What was his offering? Okay, listen carefully to his offering. 1 silver bowl, its weight 130 shekels, 1 silver basin of 70 shekels in the sacred shekel, both of them filled with fine flour mixed with oil for a meal offering. 1 gold ladle of 10 shekels filled with incense, 1 young bull, 1 ram, 1 sheep in its first year for an elevation offering, 1 he-goat for a sin offering, and for a feast peace offering, 2 cattle, 5 ram, 5 he-goats, 5 sheep. Okay, it's like a whole farm over here. 5 sheep in their first year. That is the offering of Nachshon. Okay, you probably didn't remember that whole thing. Anybody want to go? Anybody remember the whole thing? No, I'm kidding. So it's much easier to do this if you have it in front of you. But the point is, on the second day, we have the leader of Yisachar. And what did he bring? 1 silver bowl, its weight 130 shekels, 1 silver basin of 70 shekels in the sacred shekel, both of them filled with fine flour mixed with oil for a meal offering, 1 gold ladle of 10 shekels filled with incense, etc., etc., etc. The exact same thing. Okay, which is not necessarily surprising. If that was the protocol, then that's the protocol. So the Torah spends 5 verses from 12 through 17 telling you the offering of the tribe of Judah, and then another 5 for the tribe of Yisachar, and then another 5 for Zebulun, and another for Reuven, and another for Shimon, and another for Gad, and another for Ephraim, and another for Menashe, and another for Binyamin, and another for Dan, and another for Asher, and another for Naphtali. And that is why you have the longest parsha in the Torah, because 12 times the Torah is repeating every single offering that was brought, despite the fact that they were all the same thing, which is so unusual. The Torah is so concise in ink that is spent, so to speak. But the Torah is so concise in every single letter that's written in the Torah. Why would the Torah write so many times the exact same thing? Why didn't the Torah say that the leaders brought this and this list of all of the offerings? Maybe say that that's what Nachshon ben Aminadav brought from the tribe of Judah, and every other leader brought the same thing. Why do you have to spend so many verses telling you the same exact thing so many times? Okay, so if you happen to have a chumash or you look at one at some point, from chapter 7, verse 10, 12, literally until the very end of the parsha is all repetitive again and again and again. So I want to read a Ramban who has two perspectives on this. Nachmanides. So he says, okay. He says, he's got a couple of explanations. So this one, he says, is based on the quote from, he quotes a verse from Chazal, Ki mechabdai echabed. I will bestow honor to those who fear him. So all the leaders brought on this same offering, which they agreed upon together. But it wasn't possible that one should not precede his fellow, okay? Because the Mizbeach can only handle so many sacrifices at the same time. So the fact is that there needed to be some kind of order. So Hashem gave some kind of order to it of who is going to be privileged to go first. However, Hashem wished to mention all of the leaders by name and their offerings in detail, and to mention separately each one's day, and not simply to mention and honor the first one and say, this is the offering of Nachshon, son of Aminadav, and say afterwards, and so each of the leaders offered, each man on his day, because that would have just been putting them all together and not giving a distinct honor to each of them. So Hashem said, the offering of one leader is not any secondary to me as any other one. And therefore, I'm going to take the Holy Torah, which is so limited in what I'm going to write, and I'm going to go through every single person's name and in detail every single offering that they brought. And the reason is to show that I care about every single one of them. And the sacrifices of every single one of them is just as meaningful to him. And that's why we spend dozens and dozens of verses just to give us this message. And I think the broader message here is that Hashem values and honors and recognizes every single thing that we do. And it's easy for us to say, okay, what is my mitzvah compared to his mitzvah? What is my Torah learning compared to, Reb Chaim Kanievsky, who passed away a few months ago, and we talked about how he learned for 20-something hours a day and the insane amount of Torah that he covered. So I'm just this little guy or girl in the corner. I'm in my little house and I'm tapping into whatever Torah class I can or Torah learning I can. Does Hashem really notice that? I mean, look how much Torah learning is happening in the world. There are cities that have tens of thousands of people who spend their entire day learning Torah. So what is so significant about my Torah learning? What is so significant about my mitzvah? What am I going to do? I'm going to do a little act of chesed, a little act of kindness. Do you know that there are organizations in different places? I visited one in Lakewood, New Jersey a few months ago called Biker Cholim that goes through tons of chicken and beef literally every week being distributed to people who need it. They host thousands of people. They help people who are going through sicknesses and need treatments and charity. And there's organizations that help people who are sick and people who are locked out of their cars and who knows what. Like, what is my little mitzvah of chesed that I'm going to do in Jacksonville, Florida with my neighbor? What is that on the spectrum, on the radar of Hashem compared to what else is going on? And the answer is that ours is just as important as anybody else's. And Hashem cherishes every single mitzvah and gives value and recognition to us. And we we subconsciously might drown that out and say, no, what is the significance of mine? But in the eyes of Hashem, every single mitzvah that we do is extremely powerful and noteworthy. And were we to be in the context of Parshas Naso, we would be in the Torah with our mitzvah written there. So that's what Nachmanides said is one takeaway from this. Another one, which I'm just going to say briefly because we're out of time, is that even though each Nasi, even though each leader brought the same exact offerings, the intent and meaning and symbolism behind it was totally different. You could have people doing the same exact mitzvah, but one's got something going through his mind and the other one has something else going through his mind. And each one has a lot of value. And it might look from the outside that it's all one thing. I don't know, I guess we'll take the synagogue example that we used before. You go in and there's 100 people there and everybody's doing the same thing, looking in the siddur, right? But everybody is doing something very unique because everybody is holding in a different internal position in their spirituality. And we have different types of intent and kavana, and we're working through different struggles, and we're working through different things that we're working on in our Judaism. And Hashem doesn't paint us all with one stroke. It's not like, okay, they're all doing this mitzvah and that's it. They all check the box to get the same credit, but rather everybody, based on their circumstances and their intent and what they're going through internally, everything is taken into the calculation. And therefore the net result, the product of every action of a mitzvah is very different for each one. And Hashem cherishes every person's unique contribution to that, even though it's going to be very different than the next person. So that's another thing the Ramban says, that they really brought very different sacrifices, even though from the external level it looked exactly the same, but there was a lot different going on in the meaning and purpose that each person was bringing through on an individual level. Okay, that's all for today. So we're actually a little over time. Any thoughts, questions, comments on any of this? Okay, thank you so much. Good to be back.
Thank you. That was amazing.
A new year of
Thank you
Torah
so
learning.
much.
See you next week.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Have a good one. Have a good week. Shabbat shalom.